Hey guys, so we just started the broadcast. Hello, my name is Yatish. I'm currently the MCVP Finance for AIESEC US for the 17-18 term. I'm originally from AIESEC in Austin, so shout out to all my Austin people. But yeah, so we'll go ahead and I have a PowerPoint, and then if you guys have any questions afterwards, feel free to ask them. For those of you in the call, of course, you can ask questions at any time. Stop me if anything's unclear. But yeah, let's start. So I will attempt to share my screen. Yep. You guys can see the PowerPoint? That's a yes. I can't see you, so I can't tell if it's a yes or not.
I can't.
You cannot?
Yes.
You can see it. Yes or no? Can anybody not see it?
I can see, yes. Fine.
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay. Yeah, I can see it also.
Okay, cool. So it says Consultancy, MCVP Finance for the 18-19 term. And so the logistics for this is basically this is meant to replace a one-on-one consultancy space. As much as I wish you guys had enough time, I had enough time while the application is ongoing for us to have one-on-one consultancies. There just isn't enough time. And so the main thing is here's my contact information. So please reach out to me. My name, again, is Yatish via WhatsApp. Avoid Facebook. I know that all of you are Facebook friends with me, and that's fine. But if you have any questions specifically regarding finance, the application, like how my role is, what I do, just ask me via WhatsApp because that's actually the best way to communicate with me, even if it's just socially or normally. So my number, 817-673-3325, area codes +1. So with that, I'll just go straight into content, basically. So the business model of AIESEC US is quite different than a lot of other entities, but the way it works is quite simple. So we have what's, from a government perspective, we are AIESEC United States Incorporated. And so what that means is we have two sub-companies that fall into that umbrella. The first is AIESEC US, so that includes the MC and our LCs. And the second is Global Current. So it's a single entity, and basically they are a J1 visa program provider. And so what that means is they provide J1 visas to participants for companies that are external to AIESEC in order to help them have cultural development experiences and have a traineeship or an internship. And so the idea is that AIESEC US runs three main products, so GV, GT, and GE. So this is globally, Global Volunteer, Global Talent, and Global Entrepreneur. Global Currents program is the J1 program. So they work with the State Department of the United States to provide J1s. And so something that is not on the slide, but basically AIESEC United States Incorporated as a parent company gets a certain amount of visas every year, and AIESEC US does not actually utilize all of these visas every year. And so it's a use it or lose it sort of situation where if we don't use all of our visas, then we lose the remainder of them. So say we get 600 and we only use 60, then the next year we're allocated 60. And so that's problematic in terms of supply and demand, as well as our actual ability to capitalize on what the State Department's giving us. So we have Global Current since 2008. Since basically AIESEC US's business model changed, we've had Global Current as a J1 program provider to help sell or provide those visas to other companies that don't directly work with AIESEC. And so one of the big things you'll see here, as this is a finance consultancy space, is a huge discrepancy in terms of revenue versus expenses for both companies, right? And so AIESEC is a group of 10 individuals, so 10 MC members, and Global Current is three basically employees of Global Current that do J1 processing, right? And so AIESEC US, year on year, so MC plus LC revenue equates to $700,000. And so what that means is our expenses are over $1 million more than our actual revenue for AIESEC US itself. And so Global Current, on the other hand, is $1.5 million of revenue with $500,000 of expenses. These are estimates, but essentially what it boils down to is break even if we were to combine the two companies. And so what this means is essentially Global Current is churning out a lot more revenue than we are with 1/3 of the staff, and we require them in order to not actually lose money year on year, because as a business, the idea is even though we're a not-for-profit, we're not a for-loss company, right? And so one of the main things that needs to be sort of factored in when you consider this role or any role on the MC is how our business model financially affects the way that we operate and the way that we sort of go about doing what we do. And a lot of these expenses are overhead costs, things that we really cannot just cut out of the budget. So we have 10 MC salaries at minimum wage. We have a lot of different things that like cannot be cut out, but are huge expense lines. So if you have any questions, of course, just stop me at any time. But that's essentially the business model in a nutshell, is just this table. So that brings me to our current state. So this is actually the current state from 2016. And so if you look, without really needing to know all the LCs, you can see that most of the LCs that have positive bank balances is the bars are going to the right. And so we had very few LCs that actually were in debt in terms of like overall financial state and their bank balance. One thing I will say that isn't on any of the slides is the way that AIESEC US's bank account works is we have one bank account that is allocated between LCs. And so what that means is we could have a bank account that has $200,000 in it, and each LC has a certain amount that is allocated towards them based on their revenues and expenses since their creation as an LC. And so say AIESEC and Yatish was, I've generated $500,000 of revenue. We have $1 million in the bank account. Even though I don't have my own personal bank account, I have $500,000. I have a claim of $500,000 to the $1 million that we have in our bank account, right? And so the main problem there is any LC in debt is basically owing money to the rest of. Sorry, I'm in a really heavy zone. So okay, so basically, the revenue that you generate as AIESEC US is based on your LC and the MC as well. And so what that means is even if we don't have the total amount that is cumulatively, if you were to cumulatively add all the LC's bank balances plus the MC bank balance, it would not equal to our current bank balance based on the fact that LCs are in debt. And so, like I told you, this is 2016. Only a few LCs are in debt, not like a huge issue. And actually, if you look, some LCs are significantly in a positive bank balance, so they've got a lot of reserves. But this is 2017. So this is at the end of 2017. I pulled this on December 31st. The number of LCs that are in debt have significantly increased, and the number of LCs in surplus have significantly decreased. And so what this means is we actually had 6 LCs that were in surplus, and no matter the amount, go into debt. And we had 6 LCs that were in debt that stayed the same. All the LCs that were in debt did not get out of debt. There's only one exception to this, and it was because they were on the cusp of being in debt and not. And so they were basically a neutral LC in that sense. And so what we're seeing is the overall cumulative bank balance of AIESEC US has decreased significantly. I think the estimate is it's around negative $50,000 if you were to combine all of the LC's bank balances. And so what that means is the AIESEC US LCs owe the MC $50,000 based on how our financial model works. And so what that leads me to is how do we sort of the first thing you need to know is our local committees, who are they, and sort of the LC breakdown, right? So the first thing is that there are 31 entities. So there's 23 LCs, and 5 of them are general members, and 2 are full members based on our membership criteria. So our membership criteria, which is part of the OD model, essentially states that an LC hits general member or full member if they hit certain criteria. The financial component to that is if you want to be a general member, if you hit the necessary number of exchanges, you have to have a positive bank balance. That could mean that you've hit 30 exchanges, you were in debt, and you have $2 in your bank account. Technically, you are now a general member LC. And so what that means is we only have 5 LCs that hit the exchange criteria and have positive bank balances. There are a lot of LCs that actually hit the exchange criteria, but because of bank balance are not able to actually be general members. Full membership is a little more difficult by nature, and so there are only 2 full members right now. And the idea is that it's all of the LCs that have hit a certain tier of exchange based on their focus product and things like that, but also they have $3,000 in their bank account. And so this is determined to be a healthy amount of reserves. Essentially, $3,000 boils down to 10 OGB exchanges, just like as our financial model works. And so we only have 7 out of those 23 LCs that so essentially to become an LC, you have to move out of expansion status. And so we actually have so many LCs that are on alert for very different reasons, but a lot of them are actually financial. So then we have 8 expansions. And so these are newly formed LCs. A few of them are a couple years old, but once they hit general member status, then they're sort of in this new pool of becoming an LC, right? And so this is important to note when we look at the financial model. So the main factors to consider include the fact that there are 4 major stakeholders when you look at AIESEC US financially, right? Just give me 1 second, I'm gonna drink some water. So currently expansions don't factor into the affiliation fee. So our financial model is split in, it's a hybrid royalty model essentially. And so what that means is, or it's a hybrid franchisee model, I'm sorry. And so what that means is it's split into a royalty percentage per exchange. So every time a person does an exchange, a certain percentage of the revenue that is generated from that goes to the MC as sort of a way to showcase like what the MC is doing in terms of actually supporting LCs to do exchange. So we pay for the platform that that allows people to, do OGV exchanges. So like our DocuSign platform. On the incoming side, we have accountants that specifically manage that. And so there are certain fees that need to be covered. And so the royalty percentages are based on an LC's membership status, which is directly tied to their exchange number. So if they're doing more exchange, we're taking a lower percentage from them. And so the 4 main stakeholders are expansions, LCs in debt, LCs in surplus, and the MC. So an LC paying an affiliation fee that's currently in surplus is likely to become an LC in debt. So in the old model, so one thing that recently passed at this this last Winter National Conference a few weeks ago was that the financial model changed and the affiliation fee specifically, how it's calculated, changed. And so in the old model, if all the LCs in surplus paid their affiliation fee that was calculated for them, 5 out of the 25 LCs that are in surplus would actually go into debt. So 20% of our LCs would go from being in surplus to being in debt. And that's just going back a few slides. That's not even including all of these LCs that are in debt. It's basically most of the LCs that are on the cusp. So if you see some of the purple bars as well as some of the orange, yellow looking ones, those are based on their affiliation fee and their performance are being penalized such that they actually go into debt. And so one thing when you look at the current state isn't that LCs are irresponsible necessarily in their financial spending. It's that our affiliation fee is the biggest factor in terms of actually determining what their bank balance is at the end of the year. Because the affiliation fee is based on it used to be based on their revenue and exchange performance. And so an LC in debt that had high exchange performance but low revenue, or high revenue but low exchange performance, would still be penalized such that it's a cycle. Once they're in debt, they basically pay the same amount of revenue that they were generating for the year in order to try to get out of debt. And so it became a cycle that was kind of vicious. And essentially, if you look, it made our current state a lot worse year on year. And if we kept the model, it would go from $50,000 in debt, overall cumulative bank balance, to over $100,000 of cumulative debt to the MC. And so it just wasn't a healthy situation. And so we looked at how can we at least put in a model that would fix this in the short term such that whoever I'm transitioning and whoever I'm working with in terms of my successor and their successor is able to create a financial model that, based on the current model and the previous model, will affect LCs in the most positive way possible. And so a disclaimer that I have is there's not a single financial model in the world that can affect these 4 parties all positively. At least one of the parties has to be affected negatively, or at least impacted in some way that isn't beneficial to them, but is beneficial to the state of AIESEC US as a whole financially. So with that, this is a lot of text. I'll basically read it, but there's also a visual on the next slide of how the financial model works. So the old model used to calculate an affiliation fee based on a lump sum that was divided proportionate to 50% based on your revenue contribution for the last 3 years and 50% based on your exchange contribution. So if your exchange numbers were really high, but your revenue was low, the chances were you were running an OGX product as your focus. But vice versa is ICX products were higher revenue generating products. And so the model was essentially looking at if you focused on either outgoing or incoming exchange, you would be in a place where you're contributing more in one of the categories, but not in the other. And so your affiliation fee would not be unmanageable or unreasonable. But what that didn't consider was that LCs are running multiple products. They're running them well. And the top performers are doing well in every product, at least categorically, compared to other LCs that are struggling to hit general membership based on their exchange numbers. And so it was taxing, essentially, LCs that were doing really well at a proportion that they couldn't afford. And so the model that was passed now separates the affiliation fee based not on membership status, but based on an LC's bank balance. And so what that means is 227,000 total is split into 65,500 and 161,500, and it's distributed equally amongst LCs currently in debt for the 65,000, and it's distributed based on proportionate to an LC's ability to contribute for the 161,500. So this is calculated as a proportion of the current bank balance relative to the total amount of LCs in surplus multiplied by the proposed amount of 100. That's a typo. It's 161,500. So on top of that, what we noticed was we ran a correlation. We took all the data of LC's spending patterns, and we found that there's no correlation whatsoever with an LC's actual expenses to return on investment. And one of the main focuses that we always push for is return on investment. Like, what are you actually tracking? What is the outcome of something? Are you willing to reinvest in it? And we found that there's literally no correlation between an LC's expenses and their actual performance. We found that, in fact, LCs that spent less were performing more, but there was not a way to point to investment practices. So another thing that was tacked onto the model is an enforced savings initiative. What this means is it's essentially how do we incentivize and actually help LCs build reserves such that they don't overspend unnecessarily on things that actually aren't getting them returns. And so the initiative is specifically focused on LCs in debt. So 40% of all of the revenue generated can be spent by an LC in debt, and more funds can be requested. So the requesting policy is once they've spent, there's an active tracker that on February 1st, from the start of this new EV term, their revenue is from the previous fiscal year is shown as their actual spending allowance. And if they overspend that, they won't be reimbursed for anything above it unless they actually request from the MCVP Finance and the LCP Finance Subcommittee to spend more funds. And so if an LC has merit to actually be spending more money, then there's no reason for me or whoever is the MCVP Finance to actually approve these decisions. But what we found is this is a way to not only incentivize people's growth in terms of building reserves, but it also it keeps the MC accountable to monitoring how LCs are spending and offering better solutions and better suggestions as to how to create more return on investment and build reserves. So this transparency is also essential to monitoring and being able to better advise, right? And that's what I just said. And so on top of the fixed affiliation fee, which is paid every quarter, so it's paid 25% of your total affiliation fee, which is calculated at the beginning of the term, is paid on April 1st, July 1st, October 1st, and January 1st. So it's every quarter, so every 3 months, right? And so on top of that, like I mentioned before, there's a royalty percentage. So based on an LC's membership status, they pay a certain percentage to the MC based on the services that are being offered by the MC to this LC based on their membership status, right? So it's the highest for expansions. It's 40% of revenue goes to the MC, 30% of revenue goes to general member, 30% goes to the MC from general member and member on alert LCs. So like I said, you can be member on alert for financial reasons or exchange reasons. If you're not hitting our exchange criteria, you can be on alert. But if you're not hitting our financial criteria, you're also on alert. So you have to have at least a positive bank balance. Then full member LCs have to have at least $3,000 in their bank account and be hitting a high tier in terms of their exchange contribution. So they keep the highest amount of percentage of their revenue because they're doing the most exchange. And so we're still generating enough revenue from those LCs without having to penalize them for their performance, right? So this is how it looks visually. So the current model for 2018, that was, again, it's a typo. I wrote this up very quickly, sorry. So this was the model if the new model had not passed. And so this was the affiliation fee model. It was one affiliation fee that totaled $253,800 that was split into 50% and 50% based on exchange revenue and exchange numbers. And so you can see what the breakdown basically factors in terms of determining this amount. So our global affiliation fee to AI is $125,000 yearly. It has decreased in the past few years, but it is among, if not the highest affiliation fee of an entity. So like we had to actually factor in how does this affect our ability to pay that? And so we said the LCs are able to contribute towards exchange and revenue, and so they should be able to cover it, right? And so the split model looks at specifically coaching visits, the OD plus steering team fund. So one of the main focuses for OD this year is to help every expansion get out of expansion status and into general member or full member status. And so for that reason, the OD and steering team funds, which specifically focus on how can we develop all of our LCs, but prioritizing expansions getting into that next level. And so that is factored in. The MCVP OD salary is factored in for LCs in debt plus expansions. So one thing to note is the $65,500 is distributed equally amongst LCs in debt. However, the calculation is based on the denominator is the LCs in debt plus the number of expansions. So this fund is basically, it boils down to a little less than 3,000, so about 2,800 per LC in debt, which is a little more than 10 exchanges if they did only OGB. So this total was calculated at, like, there are a lot of formulas that went into how can we best distribute this model so that LCs in debt can pay and LCs in surplus aren't being taxed so heavily for it, right? And so the royalty percentages are also at the bottom if you see. So I said expansions keep 60%, MOA and general members keep 70%, and full members keep 80%. So 65 and the 161 total $227,000 of generated revenue from the fixed basically contribution that LCs give to the MC. And so this is significantly less than $253,800. And at the beginning of my term, the model actually was calculated on $287,800. And if you look at the current model for 2018, IPM and MCP salary were both, they used to actually both be factored in. And the idea was the MCP salary was around $30,000 and the IPM was around $4,000 for MCPs to go to IPM and IC. So it's not only IPM, but IPM and IC in terms of travel cost, delegate fee, all that stuff. And so those two things deducted was $34,000. So the LCs, if they hadn't passed this new model, would have paid $253,800 based on their exchange revenue and their exchange contribution. But now they're paying solely based on their bank balance and their ability to actually pay their affiliation fee. So it no longer taxes people at a rate where they cannot afford it regardless of their exchange. Cool. So this is just giving an overview of finance for the 17-18 term. So the main initiatives was when I started my term, the main focuses or the main priorities that I had was how can I work with partnership development, so Ian, on conference sustainability, how do we cut MC's costs while still increasing the revenue generation methods? And so that's, again, going into how do we work with PD and like how does PD finance synergy work in terms of conferences as well as budgeting, like supporting the budget, because every year when we create a budget, we have a certain PD minimum that we need to generate in order to support a lot of different things that the budget can't normally support on its own based on our exchange revenue. And so the idea is, we're looking back at the business model for AIESEC US to be independent, but still operating alongside Global Current, such that Global Current is no longer the reason why AIESEC US exists, because they keep us afloat, but instead we have two separate but equally sustainable companies. And so PD is a huge drive that I myself believe will allow us to be independently able to operate without sacrificing the fact that we are an exchange organization, right, or a leadership development organization. The second thing, or the third thing, sorry, was the financial model overhaul, which I just ran over with you guys. And the fourth thing is a priority with the ICX side in terms of accounts receivable collection, as well as write-offs. So we sat down right before our financial audit and said, what are the things that we're absolutely not going to collect? And is there any sliver of a chance that we can still try to collect on them? And a lot of things that we found was the accounts receivable collection methodology that we used was highly successful because we realized that there were the reasons why accounts receivable was so high were actually quite simple. So sometimes it was that the company was not contacted multiple times, or the company wasn't followed up with, or we just didn't generate an invoice even for a company. And so we basically have overhauled our accounts receivable collection methodology by changing the way that we actually invoice companies, how we follow up with them, how we interact with them. And so that was a huge finance IGT synergy, or finance ICX synergy. We have weekly meetings specifically updating myself and the team on accounts receivable, like what are we doing to collect, who's in charge of collecting from this company, who do we need to talk to at the LC level, how can we support. And so the initiatives are quite simple: conference sustainability, focusing on how we can help PD be a bigger part of our MC budget so that we're less reliant on factors like if we decrease exchange, what's going to happen? If we increase exchange, but we're not able to, still support our overhead costs, PD is a huge way for us to be able to A, build partners, B, build like a steady revenue stream if we look at the long term, but also just building an infrastructure and a culture around building partners, right? And so then the results were both our national conferences are projected closeouts of break even and even profitable outcomes. And so one thing was AIESEC US, in terms of conferences, has not been a sustainable entity at all. We've lost money on conferences. We've lost a lot of money on conferences in past years. And the main thing was PD initiatives have not only helped this, but they've also helped LCs engage with partners at a deeper level, giving them graduate opportunities, giving them monetary incentives. We worked with one of our biggest partners, with The Economist, for example. And so that helped LCs not only raise awareness of a huge partner that we have, but it also helped conference sustainability by contributing revenue towards that through subscriptions. And LCs were also incentivized to actually sell subscriptions such that their LC was incentivized monetarily by they were given part of the revenue that was generated from our partnership, right? And so then the financial model was changed for short-term opportunity of LCs. So this model, like I said, is literally a Band-Aid model. It helps LCs in the current state of being in debt get out of debt if possible in this 1 year, because if this model were to stay, LCs in surplus would be taxed at a exponential rate such that they wouldn't be able to afford their affiliation fee anymore. So like I said before, a huge transition item is how can we figure out a way to develop a financial model that not only incentivizes every category of AIESEC US to grow, but also does so in a way that is financially sustainable. And the final thing is AR has been a priority with over $200,000 either collected or written off. Our AR currently is almost $600,000, or it was $600,000, meaning companies owe us $600,000 that we have not collected. And that's a huge issue, because if you were to write off all of that, our budget would be even worse than what I already showed you. So the main thing about the finance role is it's interacting with the MCP quite directly, because the MCP is sort of the master of how we operate and like the strategies that we implement, and supporting us as MCVPs, but also interacting with the LCPs and the VPFs to build a relationship there, and also a financial understanding, so that financial literacy is no longer an issue, but it's rather a huge part of like our knowledge process. And then interacting with the plenary overall and just showcasing what finance is doing for them as members of AIESEC US. And then we have subcommittees. So I, as VP Finance, I'm also conference manager, so I work directly with OCs. I am also the main responsible in the MC for the finance subcommittee, which helps with a lot of decision-making in terms of our national support fund, helping LCs in terms of coaching structures, because they themselves are LCPs and they understand what the relationship between themselves and the VP finances are. And the final thing is also the meetings and bids subcommittee, which factors into conferences, is are we getting bids for conferences from different venues? How can we be financially sustainable on the conference side? And the final thing is the NST. So the NST for this semester is focused specifically on coaching and network management. So they're working with the VPFs to see how can they be supported for the first 6 months of their term, but also what is missing from our knowledge cycle or our empowerment cycle to actually get VPFs to make smarter investment decisions, make better actual like outcomes from their finances, right? And so the role, it boils down to very few things, but they're very time consuming. And on the national finance side, a lot of it is administrative. So paying bills, working with our lawyers, things like that. And so the finance 17-18 term boils down to these three things, is like the initiative, the results, and the role. But there's a lot more to it that I would be happy to answer if you guys have questions. So the history of finance, just in a nutshell, is looking at the past 2 years. The finance 17-18 generation, so they started in January of 2017, and they just finished. They'll be finishing February 1st. They were called the Gold Digger Network. So they made their network identity, and the idea was that their hashtag was money doesn't grow on trees, and so they wanted to dig deeper, analyze. And so one thing was, in the ideation process, we looked at what are the top 10 qualities that the network wants to embody. And just as a disclaimer, focusing on 10 different qualities was very difficult to actually capitalize on 1 or 2 or 3. So their main qualities you can read there. So they wanted to be transparent, they wanted to be knowledgeable, confident, increasingly connected, not only within finance and to each other as VPs, but also to the rest of the networks. So all understanding all the functions at a microscopic level so they can support them better. Being communicative, so delivering EBMs, being able to communicate more effectively and concisely. Being cooperative, so understanding how their cooperation with other functions worked. Being reliable, so sort of being held accountable to their own high standards. Being supportive, not only being like, as finance, you have to be able to say no. It's one of the hardest things in the role, but you have to be able to say no to things that don't yet make sense. And so being supportive in the sense that even though you're saying no, you're trying to get them to think deeper on what will make sense, right? And then creative in meeting goals. So not being a single track mindset, and instead being creative in how they achieve their goals. And then also being a sharer of financial knowledge. So rather than just having all the financial knowledge in one individual as the LCVP finance, being able to share that with either a team that they have or the EB, such that finance is a core part of how an LC operates. The 18-19 generation that was just created about a week and a half ago focused on three main things. So each one is sort of like a two-parter. So they wanted to be loud and bold. They wanted to be heard in the plenary, but also heard in a way where finance is no longer put in the back office. And so the first and the third qualities are very similar in the sense that they no longer wanted to be viewed as back office in the sense that they never communicate, they never see what's happening at the front lines of doing exchange and like actually being contributors, because I think a lot of what the network felt was that finance was more so just managing things in the back and making sure nothing goes wrong, but instead should be a proactive function rather than a reactive function. They also wanted to be more conservative and smart in their spending. We went through several hours of sessions that specifically focused on the spending patterns. Like I told you, there's no correlation between the expenses that were made and the return on investment. So they wanted to be more proactive and actually understanding of how that works. And then in a nutshell, what this boils down to is focused on building reserves, being proactive, and being outspoken leaders in the national plenary to ensure finance isn't just a necessity, but a priority to observe and analyze and act, right? And so the finance 1920 generation, I couldn't tell you what it's going to be like, but basically the 18-19 generation calls themselves the money bags because they really want to be able to build reserves and have sort of rainy day funds and the ability to actually invest rather than being in debt and not being able to spend any money to grow what they're capable of growing. So what is the momentum and focus for the next generation? That's really a huge part of what you as an applicant will be painting. Is like, what is the picture you want to paint for the 1920 generation? Because it's interesting. My predecessor, Katie, told me my success is not determined by what happens now, but rather what happens in the future and how I took from the past to build that future, right? And so it starts with the current and previous generations and learning from their actions and motivations. Each network is very different. I can tell you that as a fact from working with the 17-18 generation when I was on the NST and then became MCVP Finance for half of their term. And then also helping build the network identity for 18-19. They're very different people. And so you have to always consider how you're going to maintain the core of what finance is with these vastly different groups of people. So with that, the MCLC finance relationship, I know Roland had asked this question before we had jumped into the consultancy space, but it's in a nutshell, the MCLC relationship is not as strong as it could be, and it's to be transparent, it's not been as much of a priority as I had initially thought it would be. So communication is done through these 5 main channels, which includes newsletters, the WhatsApp group, our conferences, our NST, and the finance subcommittee. So if you notice, not many of these actually involve me as the MCVP Finance directly communicating with my LCs, because there are 31 LCs with 31 VP Finances, and if I were to sit down and have a conversation with each of them, that would be amazing. But given their time and my time, there have to be a multitude of channels in which they still get the content that I'm trying to communicate and that the network is trying to communicate. So we have monthly newsletters. We have a WhatsApp group that was very active actually during the conference in terms of like people sharing ideas, if the people are unsure, the WhatsApp group is an easy way to not only check in with your network on a social level, but it's also a way for us to sort of be supportive of each other and have, if you have any questions, they can have communication channels and just really building a network, right? Because a part of a network isn't just the work you do, but it's also like the people that you are building up and creating experiences for them. And so the WhatsApp group is a huge part in how you actually accomplish that. In terms of conferences, every touch point that we have at a conference is very important, not only to downscale education, but also make sure the network identity still makes sense. So the communication channel for conferences is really important because they don't happen very often, but they're one of the biggest, if not the biggest, way for you to influence how the network acts and actually executes decisions. The NST, like I said, is a coaching structure. So it's a network management structure where they are assigned a certain number of LCs and they work specifically with them on how can they support their financial operations, what's missing from their education, or how do they feel they need to be better supported. And the NST reports that to me so that I can at least report that to the rest of my team to understand how synergies can happen, how we can better downscale finance education to the plenary as a whole. And then the finance subcommittee specifically supports LC operations from the perspective of reviewing financial decisions, being able to look at the savings initiative. They alongside me will be making decisions of whether an LC merits having more financial investment opportunities, but also they are the main and final decision makers for the NSF, which is our National Support Fund, which is a fund that every LC pays into that is specifically for innovation and needs-based activities. So if an LC is in debt, they can apply to that to actually be given funds that aren't their own to execute on decisions. And so the finance subcommittee reviews those decisions, interacts with the people requesting those decisions, and we have weekly meetings so that we can focus on how can we better create financial literacy and sustainability. So the main points is communication was limited during the 17-18 term. There's still half of the term left, and one of my main focuses is to make sure my NST is more of a proactive body that actually helps scale communication from me to the LCs, but also I want to be more proactive in how I communicate with the LCs. And so overall MC communication remains an area of improvement that the NST supports through network management structure, but also like I said, I really want that to be more of a focus for me in this spring term so that I create the opportunity for whoever my successor is to have a very strong relationship with their finance network. So the current state is that communication is done through a few channels to communicate relevant information. And there's not a lack of information or resources necessarily, but instead each LC is vastly different in terms of their financial state, and so support needs to be individualized. And that's why the NST and the finance subcommittee are my two main focuses for the rest of the term, to make sure that every category of financial stakeholders are hit such that they feel supported and are supported. So with that, I wanted to open, I'll stop sharing my screen. You can see my face again. I just wanted to open the floor for any questions and clarifications, any thoughts or points that you wanted to add. Yeah, so I will. You don't have to have questions. It's okay.
Okay, I can go first. First off, thank you, Teach, for the information. It was really helpful. Just a more broad question, just to get to know the role more. What's something that you wish you knew at the beginning of your term that you now know?
Yeah, I think actually the last point that I made was the biggest thing that I didn't realize. And until you're in the role, it's really hard to see that network management cannot be your primary focus based on the national finances that you have to work on. I didn't think a financial audit was going to be as big of a deal as it is. I didn't think like a lot of my time goes to things that I didn't expect, but was given expectations on when I was transitioned. So, excuse me, sorry. Okay, cool. I just burped. So a lot of like when you're setting your priorities for like what your term is going to be about, a lot of it boils down to like what's feasible is not necessarily what will be feasible like when you're in the role. So when I was like approaching the application, a lot of what I looked at was like I think one of the main things is like how do you prioritize different sort of management aspects. And I think for me, it was always like national finance was going to be the priority as the national VP of finance. But what goes into that, it is just, I think you have to really budget and allocate your time a lot more effectively than I'd initially thought, definitely. And that's like something that has definitely improved is like my time prioritization has improved leaps and bounds. It's still not exactly where it should be, but I think I didn't expect it to be so time consuming to do certain things until I got the groove of it. So at first, everything will feel like it's really slow because it is. but you'll get more effective at it. So, yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. And if that didn't answer your question directly, you can ask it again. I can try it. Yeah.
Okay, it did. It did. I feel the same way over here in Thailand.
Yeah.
So similar experiences.
Yeah. And I think, too, just going off that point is, I think something I didn't expect was to lean on the finance subcommittee, the NST, and my team as much to like push a lot of the content that I wanted to push, just because my communication was very limited with my network. The NST can be played up in such a huge way that they can be like the reason why your network management is successful is how do you delegate tasks to them such that your network is supported and like is given all the resources they need to be given. Because the resources are there, like I said. It's just a question of making sure everybody feels like they understand them. And people won't ask for help oftentimes. So.
So a small question from my side. So how do you perceive the risk that global current is so important in terms of revenues for you guys, whereas it's not something that is like your core business? So it's something that's quite, you're out of your control maybe in a sense.
Yeah, totally. So that's a question that I get asked a lot. And I think my answer has finally been solidified in terms of global current. I don't view global current nearly as a risk to AIESEC US in terms of how they support us. I view it more of a risk as their core business can be affected based on external factors, right? And so like if we stop getting visas or that visa goes away, then global current as our main revenue source is no longer there. And so we have to look at how we can basically work alongside global current, because I don't think global current is a risk in the sense that it's our main core revenue, but it's not something we can directly affect. It's how can we basically, like I said before, work towards being independent in terms of our revenue generation from global current, but still understand that at any time a lot of different factors can affect AIESEC US's business and global current's business. So there's, like I said before, one of my main focuses was how can PD actually be more of a revenue generating source, and how can we increase our exchange revenue such that we no longer need global current as our main revenue source.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much.
Any other questions?
And maybe a small question about like the accounts receivable, because it's a problem from my end. So you guys started solving that problem this year to be used together with ICX. And is it something that has always been there, that problem, or is it something that at some point in time was fixed and then, you know, a lot of people didn't spend attention to it, and now you're at this point that you need to fix it again? So how are you going to make sure that also this is not like a one-time fix? And
I think thank you, John. So I think one of the main things is it's not been a singular issue. It's been an ongoing issue that has in cycles been approached and focused on, but it's never gone away completely. And I think one of the things, so John is our MCVP IGT IGE right now, and so he and I work a lot with how can I support him to collect, and how can we work together, because a lot of the collection process actually isn't it's not hard, if that makes sense. And so the reason that we're focusing on accounts receivable is we see that it's become an issue that at no point is accounts receivable necessarily a manageable issue in one single year, but it's become to the point where we know that if we don't at least focus on it, it will become more than our entire year's budget. And so the threat that we see in terms of accounts receivable itself this year is why we're focusing on it, but it has been a focus in past years. Not to say that, so the previous year focused on how can we create better systems and better ways to actually decrease our accounts receivable, because what are the people we report to our board of directors, right? And they care a lot about the manageability of our financials, and accounts receivable is something that is within our control. And the moment that an account is over a year old, it becomes further and further out of our control, right? And so we're focusing on how can we get all of the old accounts receivable out of the way, such that it's only things between 0 and 180 days of outstanding receivables. If we look, the main issue, the reason that we're focusing on accounts receivable, and it is as high as it is because some companies are years old. Like some of them are as old as 2-3 years old, and that is a huge issue for us because the point of contact could be completely different. The company might not exist anymore. There are a lot of different things that go into why our receivables are just building on each other. And I think it's just that it hasn't been a priority or a main focus. And I think it's something that is going to have to be tackled in over multiple years. But I think it's not something that we can lose sight of at any point. It's always been that we know that we have a high accounts receivable problem, but it hasn't been here's directly X, Y, and Z as to how we're going to solve it completely.
Cool. So, okay. Thank you so much.
I don't know if John has any thoughts on this, but so.
Yeah, and then one thing we did was also to change our invoicing process to help prevent future accounts receivable problems like this. So moving when we were invoicing to before we were actually shipping visas, because IGT was the biggest issue with our accounts receivable. And yeah, there was a few reasons why of things that we weren't aligned with how companies needed us to send them things. But yeah, I think like Yatish said, we always knew it was an issue, and then it just got out of control, and we had to do something.
Yeah, and just going off of that as well, as our invoicing process has changed. But one of the main things was the way that our invoicing process works is that, sorry, I get distracted very easily. Okay, our invoicing process doesn't account for the fact that if a company doesn't actually take a trainee, that they don't have to pay us for that. Our policy is that they get a 50% refund, but they can't be refunded 50% if they never paid us, right? And so then we have to write all of that off. And so the invoicing process changing is one of the biggest, it's a simple thing, but it's one of the biggest ways that we can actually, like John said, prevent future accounts receivable from being an issue. So.
So maybe the graphs you were showing about like the LC bank account showed a lot of like the financial performance of LCs over 2017. But if you look at AIESEC USA, so if you compile everything, yeah, how did it look like 2017 as a financial year?
Yeah, so our revenue generation definitely increased significantly over the past year based on the fact that we broke 1,000 exchanges. Our revenue is now more segmented based on the fact that we have focus products and things like that. But like I said before, it's not that AIESEC US is generating less revenue and expending more. It's that our main expenses are our affiliation fee. And so the reason that you saw the graph so vastly different and so many LCs in debt and so few actually in positive surplus right now is because the affiliation fee is the core expense for almost every LC. In fact, I can tell you as a fact that at least 60% of most LC's expenses are only their affiliation fee. And that is the biggest problem that actually was created from having an affiliation fee in the first place. Is the MC, just as a context, the reason that that old financial model was created was that the MC was in a significantly higher amount of debt than we currently are in. And so the LCs were in a good financial state to actually contribute towards the MC being supported. And so we built an affiliation fee model that also had royalty percentages so that we would be guaranteed a fixed revenue generation source from the LCs. But what we didn't factor in was all of the changes that would happen in between when that model was created and now, such as having a focus product, but also running multiple products, right? It was a brand new idea for LCs to run multiple products in a very scalable way. But now, based on the support and the things that we're actually offering, it makes it a lot harder. It makes it a lot harder for us to actually ask an LC to pay the affiliation fee that they do, because it's being generated on past performance, not on their current performance. And so the main thing is that AIESEC US is growing financially, but the affiliation fee model is specifically putting us back to square one or worse off than we were. And so I don't know if that answers your question directly, but LCs are generating more revenue than they ever have before, but our affiliation fee, while it hasn't changed, is directly affecting every LC that is generating the revenue for us. So it's almost like we're internally creating debt, which is not good. So you'll also notice I get distracted very easily. So if I'm not answering your question or I get off topic, just like stop me and tell me what to answer. There's John. Yeah, and if you guys, if you do have any other questions, you can always reach out to me, and if it's a question that I can answer for everybody, I'll do so. I can't, of course, answer any questions specifically about the application, but if there are certain things that you're unsure about that do factor into the application, I'd be happy to answer it for everybody. And that's what the MC group is, the applicant group is about, is I can always just create a thread and say, these are the most frequently asked questions, and everybody can, can know about them, but I can't answer individual questions necessarily. So yeah, I'll go ahead, and if there are no more questions, I can stop the broadcast. But like I said, I will be around until the application is due and after the application is due if you have any questions. So thank you guys for your time, and I will stop the broadcast. I'll stay in here for about 3 to 4 more minutes because I know we're going to be in here till at least 12. So, yep.
Thank you.